Okay, so like last time, now we're going to talk. I'll give my synopsis here. Like last time, I figured I'd give a sort of lay of the land or synopsis of the book, and focusing this time on the second half of the book, which is about stage theories of personal development. And like last time, I'll try to be
Did
charitable.
you mean to record?
What's that?
Did you mean to start recording?
I am. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, thanks. No, thanks for checking. That's the type of thing I would forget. So I'm gonna try to be charitable in these remarks again, like last time. I think it's easier to do that than to constantly give my own evaluation or judgments of what I think about it. So last time we talked a bunch about what metamodernism is, and that's really what the first half of the book is about and why it matters. And today we're going to be talking about what Hanzi proposes as the foundation of metamodern politics, which is a developmental psychology. So the key contribution of the Listening Society and the focus of the second half of the book is its sort of promulgation of stage theories, which form a quote-unquote model of hierarchical complexity, or MHC, that Hanzi offers stage theories concerning. So he gives us stage theories in four key dimensions. So cognitive development, one about sort of learning, knowledge, symbolic development, one on emotional well-being or states, and one on wisdom or depth. So the names he gives these stages are cognitive development, code, state, and depth. And together, these combine into what Hanzi calls one's effective value meme, which is just a complicated way of saying your overall stage of development, basically. Anyway, these stages of development are the sort of core of Listening Society's metamodern politics. So as we discussed last time, Hanzi insists that one of the key contributions of metamodern politics is that it offers us a hierarchy that we can use to make qualitative judgments. And the reason this is important is because without hierarchy of values, as opposed, by the way, to a hierarchy of power per se, we cannot really build collective projects or have a sort of idea of what progress looks like. So Hanzi's model of hierarchical complexity claims that it is better, both for yourself and for civilization, to be higher up on the four scales that he proposes than lower down on them. So this hierarchy becomes the basis for developing the sort of welfare apparatus of a future metamodern society, since the very notion of welfare demands an evaluative judgment of wellness. We talked last time a bit, too, about the perils of developmental blindness. In other words, in refusing to accept hierarchy of values or positions, one risks casting the world into the sort of tyranny of structurelessness. Hierarchy, and not power again, but hierarchy and principles, is, according to Hanzi, the sort of most just, the most ethical, and the most kind route that we can take. So to refuse a hierarchy of principles, he insists, is to cave into the destructive, unjust, life-seeking or life-sucking emergent processes that concretely devastate life on this planet. Yet Hanzi wants to avoid another peril, which is the embrace of sort of bad developmental stage theories, or a misreading of his stage theory that mistakes the stages as license to dominate or lord over others. So the point of these stages isn't to say that people who are at a higher stage are better than people who are at a lower stage. The point is to say that it is better for you and for society to be at a higher stage. And we should therefore build the institutions to facilitate bringing the population as a whole to higher stages. So undergirding his stage theory is an ethos, refraining from being judgmental about other people's stage attainment, not treating stage attainment as a place within a moral order, not using stage attainment for domination, and also understanding the distinction between things that are better and things that are dominant, being humble about the fact that others may be more advanced in their thinking and or feeling than you are, and also being open to the fact that they may understand things clearer than you do. Remembering that there are multiple dimensions to development. So, and some people may be quite advanced in certain areas and not advanced in others. Being sensitive to not using one stage attainment to egotistically lord over or hurt other people's feelings, sort of egotistically. And then finally, remembering that there are dimensions to life that are not encapsulated within these stages. So it's important to clarify that stages are not the same thing as phases. Phases describe normative sequences of life, such as infancy, childhood, education, career, old age, etc., whereas stages build upon one another, transcending and including the earlier stage. This is really important to Hanzi. A higher stage does not merely abandon, refute, or move on from a lower stage, although this does tend to be the case in terms of emotional states, I should say, or sorry, states, subjective states. But at least in the cognitive and symbolic stages, you don't just move on, you incorporate and transcend the earlier lower stage. And as I mentioned last week, this sounds a lot like Hegel. There's something very Hegelian about this. Okay, so what is a stage and what makes it useful? Hanzi defines it thus, quote, "It is an equilibrium at a certain degree of complexity and a form of self-supporting balance within your mind, brain, and organism," end quote. So this idea of balance or equilibrium, I thought actually had some resonance with our recent discussions with Sarah about cognitive dissonance. You know, one experiences disequilibrium when they believe contradictory things, and the pressure, which is often experienced as sort of an emotional or affective discomfort to reconcile the things one believes, seems to me to be an important part of Hanzi's stage theory in some degree. And this only becomes more important in a complex and conflict-ridden world like our own. So maybe we can just jump into what the stages he gives are. Just getting into the developmental stages themselves, beginning with the first dimension of the stages Hanzi considers, which is cognitive development. So Hanzi first drills it down into cognitive development, which is perhaps similar to IQ, but not quite the same thing. So IQ, he says, is sort of a horizontal function, whereas the cognitive development he's talking about is more of a sort of vertical function. So IQ is about how many tasks one can perform in their brain. It's about how quick and efficient one's brain is. But a model of hierarchical complexity stage is different. So it describes how well one's thinking can tackle complexity. What he means by complexity is that a more advanced stage of thinking can grasp concepts at earlier stages, but thinking at earlier stages cannot grasp concepts at higher stages because of the complexity. The earlier stages cannot see what the later stages can see, he explains, and because of this, we seldom realize when we are being out-complexed, i.e. that someone thinks and acts with higher complexity than we do. Hence the need, as I mentioned earlier, for this bit of this ethos of humility. He gives us 15 stages of cognitive complexity, and they're based on task analysis, meaning the ability of an entity to process and execute a complex task. And the scale begins at 0 with the calculatory stage, which he says is basically the task capacity of molecules, and it ends at 14 or 15 with what he calls the cross-paradigmatic stage, which he insists most adults basically never, ever will reach. He doesn't elaborate much, actually, on the earlier stages, since no human being is as simple as this in their thinking, and begins with state 10, abstract, which he attributes to humans and says about 30% of humans never actually develop beyond this. So he basically is focusing just on those stages that sort of adult humans will find themselves in. So at the abstract level, a person can think in abstractions rather than merely in concrete examples or experiences, and can therefore synthesize information and draw parallels between things and experiences. Yet the abstract thinking stage has its limitations, which he says mostly chalk up to the fact that a stage 10 thinker, quote, will tend to focus on one single variable and want either to increase or decrease its qualitative or quantitative value. Less immigration, lower taxes, more love, more dialogue, less greed. So it strikes me that most political rhetoric actually operates at this level. I mean, this is basically most political slogans: more jobs, less racism, more hope, more greatness, etc. So at the formal stage, the next stage, stage 11, which he says 40% of adults never advance beyond. I don't know where he gets these statistics, by the way, but he says 40% of adults never advance beyond this stage.
It's just Commons research, isn't it? That's where he gets it from.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's useful.
He's just stolen this from with consent from the guy he studied with.
Right, he does cite as being influential, but I just haven't read comments. Yeah. I don't know if those.
I think so. I could be wrong. But.
Oh, thanks for that. So here, a person on stage 11, a person can relate multiple abstractions to one another and form coherent systems of thought, he says. So at the systematic stage 12, I'm going to just move through a little bit faster than this one, which 20% of adults reach and never advance beyond. People think in terms of systems and recognize how abstract processes amalgamate into systems. But a limitation of this stage of complexity is that it tends to reify systems and overcode experiences and phenomena through the lens of systems. You find, he says, a strong bias towards explanations of this kind: structures, patterns, regularities, the economy, the biological body, Darwinian evolution, the gender norms, and so forth. And I think personally, I would put many partisans, sort of political partisans at this stage, and activists at this stage, people who are, without complications or prefixes, feminists, Marxists, anarchists, libertarians, right? And not sort of intersecting multiple of those perspectives or synthesizing multiple of those perspectives. Okay, at the next stage, so the metasystematic stage, which is the last one that he really explores and elaborates, because he basically says, most adults don't get any further than this. He says only around 1 to 2% of adults reach this stage. And people are able to see multiple systems and how they interact and how other contingencies disrupt the logic of systems. So this is the stage of transpartisanism, the ability to think about an issue from multiple viewpoints, and yet without losing one's grip on the stakes involved or the consistencies of these viewpoints and what they have to offer. So it's not a relativism. You actually can sort of synthesize their meaning and try to find some way in which they overlap. Rather than just, I see both sides of this issue. It's like I can integrate both sides of this issue. So again, he does not elaborate on the final two stages, so stage 14 paradigmatic and stage 15 cross-paradigmatic, because they're, I guess, so rare that nearly no one reaches them. But it's interesting to note that he is offering a paradigm in the form of metamodernism, and there might be some implication here that he sees his work as operating at this sort of paradigmatic or cross-paradigmatic level. So anyway, with each stage that he elaborates on, he offers a window into how political thinking at that stage might look, giving increasingly nuanced and sophisticated analysis from an anti-racist, conservative, feminist, libertarian, green, and economic standpoint. So for each one of these stages, he basically shows how that argument might advance or nuance. So while I found something kind of strange about this, since it seemed to imply that political positions within each of these sort of standpoints is equally capable of being advanced or sophisticated, I do think it's worth pointing out that at stage 13, metasystemic, the arguments closely resemble each other. And this is because, as Hansi says, the more complex answers to life's problems are more inclusive of a multiplicity of interests and perspectives, leading to the possibility of what he calls a deeper democracy. And this may sound a lot like relativism, but as I said, it's something else. It's a complex reckoning with many perspectives and really aiming to listen to and take them seriously and integrate them into a political position. Okay, so on to the next dimension, and I won't spend as much time on the next dimensions, but the next dimension is symbolic development. So whereas cognitive stages have to do with one's hardware, symbolic stages or symbolic development has to do with one's software or frameworks for understanding, what I suppose we might call sense-making, including language. And as such, these are inherently cultural and shared between individuals. So every symbol stage, or metameme is another term he uses for this, contains something of an understanding of the world and reality. As Hansi explains, it carries within it an ontology, in other words, a theory of reality, an ideology, in other words, a theory of what is right and good, and an identity, in other words, an idea of who or what the self is. Here we can begin to get a sense of how multiple dimensions of development can index or cross-reference to each other. So there's usually some correlation between cognitive and symbolic development, Hansi tells us, since more advanced symbolic frameworks are easier to grasp when one has more sort of cognitive complexity. And also vice versa. Advanced symbolic frameworks are more suited to complex thinking. So they're useful for each other. So here he offers 7 stages, each of which correspond to a cognitive developmental level that was sort of prevalent at a particular stage of civilization. So the first is the Archaic Stage, which corresponds to a period in which most people were at the sort of pre-operational cognitive stage. He doesn't really elaborate much on this. The second is the Animistic Stage, which corresponds to a period in which most people were at the sort of primary cognitive stage. Again, he doesn't really elaborate much on this either. The third is the Faustian stage, which corresponds to a period in which most people were at the concrete cognitive stage. Again, he doesn't really elaborate much on this one either. The fourth, and this is where he starts to elaborate a bit more, is the Post-Faustian stage, which corresponds to a period in which most people were at the abstract cognitive stage. And this is basically the stage of religious belief systems. And the one that, I think he starts to actually explore because a lot of people are still in that symbolic stage. The fifth is the modern stage, which corresponds to a period in which most people were at the formal cognitive stage. So this is basically the stage of belief in a singular and universal rationality, perhaps naively so, if we take seriously the critiques of metamodern or of postmodernism. Okay, the sixth is the postmodern stage, which corresponds to a period currently ascendant, actually, in which people are or will be at the systematic cognitive stage. So this is a stage where people question a singular rationality, talk about critiques of systems, and so forth. And then finally, the seventh is the metamodern stage, which corresponds to a period in which most people will be at the meta-systematic cognitive stage. And this is a stage that is able to integrate, as we talked about earlier, multiple perspectives and to think across multiple systems. You can find ways of fitting these together and synthesizing these. Okay, so the last two dimensions or scales of developmental stages are about feelings and emotions. So we now, Hansi tells us at the beginning of chapter 12, turn our gaze inwards. And the first of these is about happiness, sort of. And the second of these is about breadth of subjective experiences, which denotes wisdom or depth. So these are important for a theory of development, he says, because the goal of politics and culture in a metamodern society should be to increase or improve one's subjective experience. The ultimate purpose of the welfare apparatus that he says we need to build is to improve as much as possible the subjective experiences of human beings. The listening society, Hansi summarizes in the beginning of the sequel to this book, quote, is a welfare society that consists of that considers the emotional well-being of people to be just as important as their economic welfare, a society that takes into account the more intimate psychological needs of human beings, good relationships, inner security, meaning, self-knowledge. This would be a society where depression, stress, and alienation have become political issues in the same vein as security, jobs, and housing are today, end quote. So that's from the Nordic ideology. And this, of course, is why we are tackling this book in the Affect Theory and History and Politics of Emotions reading group. He's making, subjective states and subjective experiences a plane of political struggle, project improvement, collective responsibility, and there's something profoundly interesting in that. I hope we can have some discussion about that. Okay, so the first one of these two dimensions, again, is the subjective state. So here he basically looks at a spectrum of emotional experiences from lower states, which basically correspond to a perpetual misery, to medium states, which describe more or less standard emotional experiences, to high states, which basically correspond to bliss or nirvana at the very, very high end of the spectrum. So Hansi builds his theory of subjective states upon a very important claim, that feelings aren't just something that passively happens to us. They're something that we can change. Following in the footsteps of the Romantics with their concept of Bildung, or education, in sort of both a logical and an aesthetic register, he insists that the inner landscapes are transformable. We should, he tells us, intentionally curate and influence our, quote, felt and embodied encounters with the beauties, mysteries, and tragedies of life, end quote. So this is important because if subjective states are not changeable, then thinking of them in terms of development doesn't really make sense. We must, he says, have a sort of pragmatic romanticism, meaning that we believe we can intervene in subjective states. So delivering people to high states such as, quote, magnificence, majesty, vastness, greatness, splendor, love, joy, clarity, openness, compassion, certitude, flow, jubilation, playfulness, fullness, enlightenment, lightness, peace, presence, power, realness, humility, freedom, etc., should be the goal of a welfare society. Yet we should not conflate these states with particular emotions, or states in general with particular emotions per se. High states, he says, can show up through gritted work, in bitter struggle, in releases from righteous rage, in vengeance, and in the deep satisfaction of surrender, and the heart-opening sadness and overflowing sorrow. So here I think he's pointing to something that Aristotle wrote about, that, the happy, good life was not the same thing as the hedonistic pursuit of pleasure. A certain amount of discipline or self-control, or what Aristotle called virtue, is really needed to access a more complete form of happiness and contentedness. And I don't think Hansi addresses Aristotle explicitly, but I think there's some parallels here. Okay, so low subjective states are associated with feelings of anxiety, angst, rage, hatred, bitterness, imprisonment, slavery, humiliation, loss, loneliness, meaninglessness, unrealness, confusion, boredom, etc. And likewise, these low subjective states should not be conflated with particular emotions. One may have a lot of tragedy and sorrow in their life, and we'll talk about this when we talk about depth in a second, and still occupy a high subjective state. The state describes the overall felt picture, not the particular emotions. So it's almost like an index of things that one feels throughout, like across a span of time in their life. Okay, so how do we go about improving people's states? This is the role, Hansi tells us, of spirituality. And spirituality not in the religious sense, but in the sense of human activities, experiences, and practices which concern the three highest categories of subjective states: the perspectives on life and the world that flow from such states, and the elaboration and teaching of these perspectives, he says. But he warns we should be wary of cults and shortcuts. So too often people with high subjective states and low cognitive and or symbolic development can lead us astray, whether they're others or ourselves. Or we ourselves could try to skip developing ourselves cognitively and or symbolically and only seek spiritual enlightenment. And this makes us blind and vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation and unjust hierarchy. We must be aware, too, of what he calls high state pathologies, so interpreting good feelings in arrogant or megalomaniac sort of ways. In other words, we should both avoid gurus and avoid becoming gurus. So finally, the last thing, and I'll wrap it up with this, Hansi investigates depth, which he describes as the experience one has with various subjective states. So not just maintaining yourself in a state of bliss, but having familiarity with other states. So depth is very similar to wisdom, and people with great depth, he says, are the ones who have experienced a wider range of subjective states. So crucial to this are experiences of beauty, mystery, and tragedy, and how familiarity with these is integrated into our memories and our personalities. So depth allows us to understand the significance of things. It allows us to see the contrast and relationship between great suffering and bliss, to grasp the fundamentally mysterious nature of being in this world, to understand beauty, which is not just about the good, but the interrelationship between the good, the bad, and everything in between. To be acquainted with tragedy and the many tragedies of existence. And Hansi ends his chapter on depth saying, only broken hearts can save the world. And something about that deeply resonated with me. Yet there are also, he says, light and dark depth or wisdom. And one might have more acquaintance with lower states, and this will make your wisdom more dark, he says, or your depth more dark. Whereas if you have more experience with higher states, then your depth might be more light. So if you're spanning from 4 to 9 or whatever it is, you're going to have a different version of depth. So not all depths are alike. Okay, so just to zoom out now and look at all 4 of the dimensions of development. So all 4 of these scales or dimensions of human development combine into what Hansi calls one's effective value meme, which is kind of like an index of one's overall state of development. So one's effective value meme, he says, quote, largely determines the overall pattern of their values, logics, personalities, and behaviors. And these things, he insists, need to develop if we are going to effectively navigate this world and its problems. So this is a crucial thing and sort of foundation of metamodern politics, improving the people in this world. As the German Romantics insisted, as summarized by one scholar, quote, a republic cannot succeed if the people are not ready for it. A republic has high moral ideals, which are worthless in practice if the people do not have either the knowledge or the will to live by them. For a republic to work, it must have responsible, enlightened, and virtuous citizens. If the people are not to participate, are to participate in public affairs, they must know their true interests and those of the state as a whole. And if they are to be responsible citizens, they must have the virtue and self-control to prefer the common good over their private interests. But such knowledge and such virtue are possible only through education, and indeed by a very deep and thoroughgoing one, end quote. So that's what one scholar says on the German Enlightenment's perspective on education. And I think in a similar way, Hansi is insisting that the population of the world has a sort of developmental demographic, as he puts it, that must be improved if we are going to be able to live in a metamodern society. And the complex, interconnected nature of the world today really demands that we do develop to this sort of metamodern stage. We live, he says, essentially and here's his condemnation of where we are now, and failing to live up to that. We live, he says, essentially in a retarded world. Our value systems do not correspond to the society we live in. Our ways of seeing, sensing, feeling, acting, and understanding do not correspond to the very society that we ourselves have created. This glitch is lethal, he says. And this is the issue of our age, to develop the political psychology of the world population, end quote. And we must do so, according to Hansi, on all four dimensions. To do so sufficiently would mean adopting, quote, a metamodern value meme, where the self is recognized as a transpersonal individual, where the mission is to help humanity and other creatures develop in a harmonious and sustainable manner, and where our understanding of reality is more attuned to potentials and potentialities than to facts and actualities. So this is generally what he means by development, and that is really core of the second part of the book. So I think I'll just leave it there. That's sort of my synopsis. I hope that is useful, especially for those who didn't get a chance to read it.